Hello, I'm a spinning grey cube and I'd like to talk to you today about Victor Orban. Recently, members of the European Parliament for the British Conservative Party voted against a motion to censure Victor Orban, and they should not have done that. I'm not entirely sure what the word censure means though, so from this point onwards I'll be using the word bollocking. The European Parliament passed a motion bollocking Hungarian authoritarian ethno-nationalist premier Victor Orban for basically being in contravention of everything Europe holds dear and threatened sanctions under Article 7 of the European Constitution. Specifically, we're talking about peddling anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, racism against the Romani people and shutting down news organisations he disagrees with. Now, since this is 2018 and this is the internet, I better be clear here, those are the bad things, those aren't the things that Europe holds dear. The vast majority of European political parties from across the political spectrum voted for this motion, and every single party that is actually in power did so, except for the Conservatives. Now, I know there are people who will say that Orban isn't anti-Semitic, and that some of his best friends are immortal space lizards who murdered Jesus. And they might just go on to suggest that I know nothing about what's going on in Hungary. Because it's 2018 again and this is the internet, I better just point out here that I don't really think that Jews are immortal space lizards. That was sort of a joke. Anyway, yeah, I don't know anything about Hungary. I'm just basing my judgment here on the views of every major political leader in my local continent. Even the Conservatives didn't vote against the motion because they disagreed with the allegations themselves. Their excuse for voting against it was that this was the European Parliament overstepping the remit of its powers, which is odd since the remit of its powers are defined by the European Constitution set forth in the Maastricht Treaty, Article 7 of which exists specifically for this purpose. However, Article 7 has never actually been used before, so perhaps the Conservatives simply thought that while it exists, it could be ignored or treated as a joke, like food banks and the homeless, for example. But I would argue that there is a deeper reason why they are wrong, and for that we need to investigate a little bit history, a subject I know almost as much about as Hungarian politics. The European Union, established by the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, grew out of the European Economic Community, established by the Treaty of Rome in 1959, which in turn grew out of the European Steel and Coal Community, established by the Treaty of Paris in 1951, which happened shortly after quite a big war. Which war was that, you might ask? Was it the War of the Roses, or the Opium War, or the War of the Ring? History is full of wars. There was even a War of Jenkins' Ear in the 18th century. That century was so full of wars that they'd run out of good names. Imagine having so many of a thing that you ran out of good names for it. It would be like Jacob Rees-Mogg's children. Incidentally, I do predict that Jacob Rees-Mogg's next child will be called Jenkins' Ear. Or maybe Victor. No, this war was called the Second World War. And world in this context can be taken as a synonym for very, very bad. 50 to 80 million people died, and it was started in Europe by a chap named Hitler, who was an authoritarian ethno-nationalist who spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and racism against Roma peoples. And if those words sound a little familiar, it's because I said them earlier about Victor Orban. Deliberately, on purpose. Now, you may also notice that the Second World War has a number in its name. This is because it was the second very, very bad war, and because it was the second one, it was generally agreed that some new ideas were required to prevent Europe from kicking off a third one, so that if it did happen, at least it might happen somewhere else, like Australia or the moon. One of those ideas was that you could both boost Europe's post-war industry and economy and prevent war between European nations by forging greater economic links between them. Hence the Treaties of Paris and Rome that led later to the formation of the EU. Certainly pan-European trade was part of it too, but that's not a bad thing. It's the reason why we have such a great range of food in supermarkets today. I was a child in the 70s and back then it was just spuds and cabbage every day. Mind you, that might just have been my mum's cooking. Has the EU been successful in preventing war? Well, war between major European powers these days seems unthinkable, which is pretty impressive when you consider that we've been at war with France for about half of the past 900 years. A more recent example of this in the UK is the Good Friday Agreement that ended the Troubles in Northern Ireland. That was built on the principle that there would be no hard border between the North and South, which would have been impossible without the European Union. This is the reason why the Irish border situation is one of the major sticking points in Brexit negotiations. The reason why these MEPs are supporting Orban has nothing whatsoever to do with the right thing, whatever that is, and everything to do with political expediency. The Conservatives have got pretty good form for that. That's why David Cameron called the Brexit referendum. It's why Theresa May called the general election last year despite promising not to. And it's why Boris Johnson made every single political decision of his life. Orban is a Eurosceptic, and they think that having him on side will help them with the Brexit negotiations. Now, I would have some sympathy with this. After all, Brexit, especially the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, is the greatest existential threat to this nation for a generation. Certainly since the Cold War, possibly even since the very, very bad War Number 2. But there is one thing that is a greater existential threat to the country, and that is World War III, particularly if it starts in Europe, but pretty much anywhere except the moon. So the reason why Conservative MEPs should not have supported Victor Orban is because they are supporting neo-Nazis. Please do not support neo-Nazis.